Hey there, friends. Tonight we're diving into something wonderfully strange and endlessly fascinating, the mysterious world of medieval mental health. What did it mean back then to feel anxious, low, restless, or just plain off? Well, let's put it this way. Therapy definitely wasn't part of your local blacksmith's loyalty program. Before we set off on this curious journey, take a moment to gently tap that like button and subscribe. But only if you honestly enjoy what happens here, in this odd little corner of the internet. And hey, drop a comment to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always a joy seeing this weird history tribe stretch across time zones. Ready? Dim the light switch on a fan for that cozy white noise hum. And let's slowly ease into the strange, creaky mind of the Middle Ages. Let's begin with the basics. In medieval Europe, your moods, your thoughts, your energy levels, even your tendency to weep over burnt porridge weren't seen as mysterious quirks of the human mind. No, they were the work of a bubbling stew of internal bodily fluids. Real fluids. Not metaphors, not vibes. Actual sloshing juices inside your meat suit. And someone somewhere probably tried to measure them. This gloriously squishy system came courtesy of the ancient Greeks, specifically Hippocrates and Galen. And like many bad ideas, it lasted for centuries longer than it should have. This was the grand theory of the four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Your health, your personality, even your soul's mood were all ruled by the balance or terrifying imbalance of these fluids. Too much blood. Congratulations. You were lively, cheerful, energetic, right up until you annoyed everyone and got treated with leeches to calm you down. An excess of yellow bile, angry, impulsive, probably great in battle, but absolutely terrible company at dinner. Black bile. That was the juice of melancholy, a slow, gloomy condition that sounds suspiciously like depression, but was blamed on cold, dry environments, and frankly, too much sitting around thinking about life. And then there was phlegm, the liquid of the slow, the calm, the maybe he's just really, really tired sort of folk. So what did you do when sadly hit? You didn't need therapy. You needed a bucket and a guy with a very sharp knife. The medieval cure for heartbreak, despair, or restless gloom was good old-fashioned bloodletting, a charming little process where someone opened your veins and hoped you felt better before you blacked out. And if bleeding you like a pig didn't perk you up, no problem. Next up, laxatives. Because obviously, when your soul aches, the real problem must be your bowels. Physicians, and that term's doing a lot of heavy lifting here, would diagnose you with pressing questions like, so, do you feel moist or dry today? They might sniff your urine consult, the position of Saturn, or lean in for a whiff of your breath. No matter what, the verdict was always the same. Your humors were out of whack. You were too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, or just too complicated for anyone but God Himself to sort out. And least you think these ideas were fringe nonsense, nope. This has been mainstream medicine for hundreds of years. So when you picture some poor medieval soul mid-panic attack, Don't imagine a friend offering tea and a kind word. Picture a man in robes holding a scroll of fluid charts and a razor-sharp blade gently saying, "Let's drain the sadness out of you, shall we?" But wait, what if your humors were fine and you still feel weird? What if the sadness, the anxiety, the midnight restlessness couldn't be blamed on demons' sin or your neighbor's cursed rye bread? Then the real suspect appeared: the moon. Yes, that bright celestial disco ball in the sky was believed to directly mess with your mind. The word lunatic didn't fall from the stars by accident. It came straight from luna, the Latin word for moon. And people truly believed that soaking up too much moonlight could scramble your brain like an undercooked egg. And this wasn't just peasant gossip either. Doctors, priests, philosophers, even that ranting guy who lived by the well accepted it. The belief was simple: the moon was a moody, powerful body, and its light could stir your brain fluids, which were thought to slosh around inside your skull, like gloomy soup whenever the moon hung just right in the sky. So if you acted strangely during a full moon, restless, odd, maybe even whispering to goats, you weren't stressed or neurodivergent. You were moonstruck. Some poor folks were locked away temporarily until the moon cycle passed a sort of medieval mental health waited-out plan. The moon took the blame for everything from epilepsy to insomnia, hallucinations, to late-night crying jags. If you were pacing at midnight or sobbing into your hay mattress, no one asked about your childhood. They squinted up at the sky and announced moons doing something weird again. Even animals weren't safe. Farmers swore their sheep got jumpy under the full moon. Their dogs howled differently. And if an ox kicked over a cart or a pig bolted into the forest, someone would always say, "It's the moon's fault." Naturally. Science proof, pfft. They didn't have those. Medical texts casually referenced planetary alignments the way we toss around coffee brands. Treatments involved not just herbs and diet, but astrology, because sometimes it wasn't madness. It was just bad moon vibes. And if your mind truly cracked, if you start wailing into your bread loaf, rhyming in couplets, or arguing with the trees, the first person they called wasn't the town healer. It was the priest. Because in medieval Europe, your mind wasn't a medical problem. It was a spiritual battleground. Any unusual behavior, sadness, anger, daydreaming, was automatically seen through the lens of heaven and hell. Depression maybe, but probably sin, or demons, or that weird moon again. So, you'd sinned and forgotten about it. Classic mistake. Anxiety, oh, that was just the devil getting comfy, fluffing up his little pillow in the cozy corners of your soul. Hearing voices. Well, friend, that was a textbook demonic Airbnb situation. In the Middle Ages, priests were the de facto mental health specialists, except their version of therapy didn't involve gentle conversation or guided breathing. Instead, you got confession fasting and the solemn reminder that you were dust and really ought to start acting like it. If you start showing what we'd now gently call symptoms of mental illness, the first stop wasn't a doctor. It was a moral evaluation. Were you skipping mass, coveting the neighbor's wife, laughing too loudly at the market? Suspicious, very suspicious. Your condition might not call for herbs or leeches. It might require repentance and possibly a nice long chat with God about your failures. But what if you weren't just gloomy or unfocused? What if things get serious, visions, mutism, erratic behavior? Well, then the church reached for the heaviest tools in its spiritual medicine chest. These included prayer vigils, exhausting pilgrimages, and in certain unsettling cases, minor exorcisms. Just to make sure your sadness wasn't actually a demon wearing a convincing, depressed peasant disguise. Can't be too careful. Even normal human emotions were watched closely. Excessive joy, vanity. Too much sadness, sloth of the soul known as acedia, or spiritual depression. The treatment, a heavy dose of psalms, and an even heaviest serving of guilt. If you were melancholic, you weren't viewed as someone greatly kind. You were seen as morally slippery, possibly lazy, probably sinful, and definitely not trying hard enough. The dark irony here. Many people actually liked these explanations. In a world with no neuroscience where the workings of the mind were terrifyingly mysterious, it was oddly comforting to believe that suffering had cosmic purpose. It gave structure to life's chaos, even if that structure involved endless chanting and the occasional sprinkle of holy water. But if you were unlucky enough to have a serious mental disturbance in the Middle Ages, your best hope wasn't a skilled healer. It was finding a priest with a gentle bedside manner and a low enthusiasm for yelling demon at confused townsfolk. So, you've been hearing voices, having visions, maybe chatting a bit too fondly with your soup. In our world, this might earn you therapy medication, or at least a concerning recommendation for a self-help podcast. But in medieval Europe, you got an exorcism. Yes, for many mental health troubles, the go-to remedy was not counseling, but a full-scale spiritual eviction. The logic was simple. If you were acting weird, it wasn't stressed or traumatic. It was Beelzebub renting space behind your eyeballs. And he wasn't paying rent. Exorcisms came in two flavors. The minor kind, which involves intense prayer circles, muttering, and generous amounts of holy water. And then the major kind, a medieval Broadway performance starring one disenchanted patient, one dramatic robed priest, and a supporting choir of monks humming Latin in the background. The rituals varied by region and priestly creativity, but the essentials were the same: scripture, reading signs of the cross, frantic chanting, relic waving, and occasionally bellowing things like, "Depart, foul spirit," directly into the afflicted's face. If you flinched, that was proof it was working. If you didn't flinch, they just shouted louder. Some unlucky souls were tied down, dusted with salt, or forced to gulp holy water by the cupful. Fasting was common because obviously starving someone half to death could only make them more spiritually pure. One unfortunate man reported had demons smoked out of his ears, using burning sage and frankincense and what was certainly a fundamental misunderstanding of ventilation. And if none of this worked, if you stayed strange and spooky after the chanting ended, well, either you were declared hopeless or worse, you were simply labeled wicked by nature. Good luck shaking that reputation at the next village festival. But here's the odd twist. Not every exorcism was a terrifying private ordeal. In many villages, they were public spectacles, a kind of holy street theater. Everyone gathered in the town square to watch the priest wrestle invisible devils, cheer for spiritual victory, and whisper fresh gossip for weeks afterward. A supernatural showdown for the entire neighborhood. Part religious rite, part horror play, part medieval soap opera. Of course, most people who undergo these rituals weren't possessed by demons. They were overwhelmed, traumatized, neurodivergent, or simply unlucky enough to suffer a panic attack in front of a bishop. Wrong place, wrong century. But what if you weren't quite disturbed enough for an exorcism? What if you were just odd? You wept for no clear reason. You forgot your own name now and then. You stared at firewood too long, thinking about the nature of existence. Well then, good news. You skipped the ropes and the shouting. Bad news, you still got locked in a room for days of quiet prayer. This was called the gentle approach to mental suffering. The belief was that your distress wasn't medical, it was spiritual. A battle between you and sin itself. The cure, silent self-reflection, strict discipline, endless repentance. In short, have you tried feeling worse about it? Because in the medieval mind, suffering was spiritual soap. It scrubbed away your soul's dirt. So if you were already suffering, congratulations. You were halfway healed. Monks and nuns, some truly kind, others simply exhausted, will guide you through this process. There'd be fasting, vigils, hard beds, awkward silences, relentless prayers. The goal: starve the devil or exhaust him into leaving, or exhaust you into not caring anymore. Some people voluntarily entered monasteries just to escape their troubled minds, a medieval retreat center, if you will. Not a spa, more of a holy time-out box. You got a tiny cell, a Bible, 8 hours of daily chanting, and the occasional bowl of thin stew. Whether this soothed mental illness or simply buried it under layers of religious fatigue is a question historians still politely avoid answering. And then there were the relics. Feeling unwell, touch the bone fragment of a saint. Trouble sleeping, curl up next to a vial of martyr's blood. Sad for no clear reason. That's what the toe of Saint Euphemia was for. In medieval thought, holiness was contagious like kindness or fleas. To be fair, this was about as close to compassionate care as you can find in many places. Unlike beats or surprise exorcisms, the relic route rarely involved bruises, just lots of chanting and frequent reminders that your thoughts were problematic. Sometimes monks truly help people offering community quiet and a strict daily rhythm. Other times, they just told you to fast and pray until sunrise, hoping divine clarity would arrive before starvation did. But what if your struggles went beyond the occasional gloomy sigh or candle-gazing session? What if you started wandering barefoot through town, muttering about angels, or passionately debating theology with barn animals? At that point, medieval kindness took the form of a small, windowless stone room with no doorknob on your side. Welcome to the monastic cell, or as some gently call it, protective isolation. These little rooms tucked inside monasteries or churches were meant as mercy. Meant. You wouldn't be chained, hopefully, or beaten usually, but you'd be strongly encouraged never to leave sometimes for years. The decor was minimalist, to say the least. Bare stone walls. Maybe a straw mat. If fortune smiled, a tiny window just big enough to shove through a bowl of cold gruel twice a day. Human contact was rare because your madness was assumed to be contagious, emotionally, spiritually, maybe even atmospherically. No one wanted to catch whatever strange spirit afflicted you, but you weren't completely forgotten. Monks might murmur prayers outside your door. A kind brother might sneak in herbs or softly read psalms delivered in a tone that suggests you weren't the worst case they'd seen this month. Sometimes these stone cells weren't tucked inside monasteries at all, but stood as early public institutions, the ancestors of asylums. These were rare in medieval Europe, but popped up in Islamic cities, and by the 13th century, in places like London and Paris. But let's not kid ourselves. The goal wasn't recovery or healing. It was sheltered. Containment. Quiet. To be fair to the medieval mind anyway, not all their beliefs were cruel. Many thought the mentally unwell were closer to God, touched by the divine, walking that fine line between prophecy and peculiarity. But practically locking someone away was easier than figuring out what to do with them. Families would be monasteries to take in afflicted relatives, offering donations and promises, because the alternative was explaining why Uncle Thaddeus was in the cabbage patch again, reciting Latin and waving a turnip like a sword. And heaven help you if you were a woman in medieval Europe who found herself overwhelmed, tearful, irritable perhaps, after your 11th child or your 3rd husband with plague breathing. Congratulations. You were almost certainly diagnosed with hysteria. And by diagnosed, I mean labeled with the all-purpose excuse for why this woman is making men uncomfortable. Crying too much. Hysteria. Not enough crying. Suspicious, possibly witchcraft. Expressing opinions, ambition, or general fatigue. Definitely a uterus problem. The very word hysteria comes from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. The theory, brace yourself, was that a woman's uterus could become unmoored and wander freely through the body, causing trouble wherever it drifted. Yes, your womb could literally go rogue, floating around your insides like an organ-shaped prankster, ruining your mood and your day. Symptoms of hysteria include shortness of breath, fainting, nervousness, weeping, fits of laughter, emotional outbursts, and according to at least one serious medieval source, too much thinking. A grave and dangerous condition indeed. Treatments varied wildly. A priest might prescribe prayer and fasting. A physician might recommend foul-tasting herbs. And in especially awkward cases, yes, manual stimulation by a midwife or early gynecologist was suggested to calm the wandering womb. Let's all take a deep breath and thank the modern world for better options. If that wasn't enough, marriage was also considered a cure. Unmarried, you needed a husband to settle your uterus. Married, obviously, you needed another pregnancy. Either way, your mental health was treated with more chores and less rest. And if you still dare to act strangely, seeing visions, resisting housework, talking too wisely about scripture, you might cross the line into witchcraft territory. After all, nothing screamed dangerous lunatic like growing herbs or asking too many thoughtful questions. But it wasn't all bleak. In some cases, convents offered women relief, a life of prayer and silence away from the chaos of marriage and childbirth. Emotional distress could be reframed as spiritual struggle, not failure. Some nuns even wrote painfully honest reflections on despair and anxiety texts that sound startlingly modern today, minus the demons and wandering wombs. Still, if you were a woman in medieval Europe with inconvenient feelings, the safest mental health strategy boiled down to this: keep it quiet, keep it brief, and for heaven's sake, don't talk to your cat in public. Because in a world where monks prescribed fasting, priests blamed demons, and physicians swore by wandering uteruses, sanity was less about being well and more about knowing when to shut up and smile. Of course, if prayers and repentance didn't work and you weren't bleeding your soul out through your ankle, there were still the quiet champions of medieval mental health, the herbalists, often elderly women with gardens, cats, and an unsettling amount of common sense. These so-called cunning folk were the village's unofficial therapists, some unlicensed, unregulated, and suspiciously effective. Unlike the priests and physicians who saw madness in every shadow, the herbalists asked questions that actually made sense. When did it start? How's your sleep? Is your mother-in-law bothering you again? They didn't fret over your humors. They brewed tea, mixed tinctures, and more importantly, listened. The talking part was cleverly disguised as plant advice. You'd shuffle into a smoky cottage, heavy walls with drying herbs, and before long you'd be sipping a brew of valerian root and lavender, ranting about your neighbor's disrespectful pig. It was therapy disguised as wart cure. Sadness was met with calming infusions. Anxiety soothed with chamomile and balm. Real distress, mugwort, St. John's wort, or in truly desperate cases, a generous poppy dose so strong you'd time travel to next Tuesday. These women weren't scholars. Their knowledge came from mothers and grandmothers whispered over fires and passed like recipes, seasoned with something modern doctors call actually listening to the patient. Naturally, this made them a little suspicious to everyone else. The church didn't trust them. After all, they heal outside the system. No scripture, no sin talk, no threats of hell. Just tea candles and good advice. Some townsfolk value them quietly. Others got nervous when the herbalist became too popular, too skilled, too confident. That's when whispers of witchcraft began. After all, what kind of dangerous woman told people they weren't cursed, just tired and undervalued? Were their treatments perfect? Not remotely. Sometimes they make you rub onions on your feet. But compared to getting locked in a stone room or shouted at by a monk swinging a goat skull, the herbalist's cottage was practically spa-level luxury. So far, we've had prayers, isolation, and garden witchcraft. But medieval mental health care had one final level, the truly creative solutions. The is this medicine or a fever dream cures? Let's begin with the dead owl treatment. No joke. If you suffer from melancholy or excessive thinking, which apparently was a disease, one wise remedy was to tie a dead owl to your head. Why? Because owls were symbols of wisdom. The bird will suck the confusion out through your scalp or attract flies. Mostly flies, still feeling anxious. How about powdered emeralds? Yes, real gems ground into dust and rubbed on your chest, or worse, swallowed. It didn't ease your mind, but it did ruin your digestion and your jewelry. Then came the astrology cures. Not so much medical as celestial mood checks. Mars in a bad mood. Sorry, nothing to do but wait for Jupiter to cheer up. One manual suggested wrapping the disturbed person in wolfskin during a thunderstorm to scare the madness away. Another whispers secrets into the left ear of a black dog and let it run off with your sorrow like the world's saddest therapy courier. Some treatments involved pigeons. Stuff herbs into the bird, wave it around the patient's head, and hope the scent or the sheer absurdity scares the illness off. Whether this worked on the patient is unknown. It definitely angered the pigeon, and if none of that helped pilgrimage, the medieval all-purpose fix. Grab your sandals, take your staff, and walk hundreds of miles to a holy site. If you didn't find divine peace, at least you'd get enough blisters to forget why you were sad. These bizarre remedies remind us medieval medicine wasn't always cruel, just wildly misinformed, weirdly experimental, and occasionally bird-based. But they gave people something better than nothing hope, which for a peasant in 1274 was as close to Prozac as you'd get. Every town, large or small, also had that guy. You know the one. Odd clothes, talking to himself, blessing chickens, cursing puddles, the village madman. And strangely, people didn't always lock him up or call the priest. Sometimes they just let him be. In an age where mental illness was feared or punished, this was quietly progressive. The strange openness weren't always exiled. Often they became part of daily life, like bad weather, or that one goat who thought he owned the main road. The town madman or madwoman, though women risked witchcraft charges, held an odd social role, not quite threat, not quite joke, sometimes even denied. In some places, they were seen as touched by God. Prophets, holy fools. If they claim strange rhymes while staring at the sun, people assume it was divine wisdom or just Wednesday. They got names like Old Will, the Wanderer, Mad Meg, or Tom Fool. Yes, that Tom Fool. Pub names, practically. These outcasts slept in abandoned mills' church porches, or literal barrels, Diogenes style. Townsfolk sometimes left food or patched shoes, or simply gave a wide berth. Children were told not to stare, which of course made them stare harder. Occasionally, their oddness sparked charity. A baker might leave crusts. A blacksmith might fix their stick. Medieval people, for all their fear and superstition, could be unexpectedly kind, especially with guilt and the threat of hellfire nearby. But patience had limits. Too much shouting, too much chaos, too much disturbance, and the tolerance snapped. Then came the priests, the prayers, the exile, or worse. And what of depression, real dark, dragging sadness? Today we call it chemical imbalance, life pressure, bad Mondays. Back then it was acedia, spiritual failure, a deadly sin. Before sloth took the top spot among sins, acedia was the medieval word for soul weariness, sadness at divine good, a deep apathy towards life itself. Picture a monk at noon, meant to copy psalms, staring at the wall, wondering what the point was. Modern word, burnout? Medieval word, moral crisis, requiring serious rebuke and possibly extra prayer beads. No comfort waiting sufferers of acedia, no gentle advice or rest. Just stern warnings, pray harder. Work more, repent faster. Depression wasn't sickness, it was selfishness with bad PR. No joy in your soul, your fault. Pray better, confess deeper. Maybe, just maybe, you were secretly proud. Or worst of all, you'd let Satan set up shop in your spirit like some uninvited renter. And so the suffering monk, crushed under guilt, sorrow, and endless labor, did what many in the Middle Ages did best, picked up his rosary and kept praying. And if you dared to express your sorrow out loud, if you sobbed too heavily, wept too openly, or simply looked a little too gloomy during morning prayers, you weren't just pitied, you were dangerous. Sorrow could spread. Like emotional mildew creeping into the walls, soaking the air of the monastery, turning holy silence sour. No one wanted a mood contagion in the chapel. Lay people weren't safe from this thinking either. If you couldn't summon joy while plowing fields or scrubbing turnips, it wasn't because life was brutally hard, or because your sixth child had the plague it meant you were sinful, spiritually defective. You needed confession penance, and maybe a shed built entirely out of guilt. Ironically, some of the most honest descriptions of despair came from monks themselves. They wrote about numbness, exhaustion, restlessness, suicidal thoughts. But instead of therapy or understanding, they prescribed fasting and mentally listing every sin they'd ever committed, preferred in alphabetical order. Take that anxiety, and you'd think in a world where most people own 2 shirts, one of which definitely had fleas, laughter might be encouraging. A brief chuckle, a tiny joy to soften the plague-ridden, mud-splatted, leech-happy nightmare that was medieval life. Think again. In medieval Europe, laughter wasn't just discouraged, it was suspicious, dangerous, a moral red flag. Peasants laughed, jesters laughed. Occasionally a monk gasped when a goose did something scandalous in the cloister pond. But the serious folk, the theologians, the chroniclers, the men who furrowed brows for a living, warned that laughter was the gateway drug of emotions. First came the giggles, then came chaos, possibly dancing. The church kept close watch. Thomas Aquinas, whose sense of humor was rumored to be filed under pending development, wrote that laughter should be moderate and serve a higher, holier purpose. Uncontrolled laughter, a sign of spiritual disorder or demonic influence. After all, who laughs without reason, answer anyone with a pulse and bad wine. Women, of course, were doubly suspects. A laughing woman trouble, possibly witchcraft. A silent woman, perfectly pious or dangerously dehydrated, and the mad. Oh, they laughed too, but in the wrong moments at funerals, during Mass, while milking goats. Their giggles weren't ending. They were warning signs, evidence of possession, a red flag with a tambourine. Some monasteries went so far as to forbid novices from laughing during meals, prayers, or any activity that might involve joy. Spiritual joy was acceptable. Belly aching, snort wine through your nose, joy forbidden. Even if Brother Matthew did slip on a turnip, still humor survives. It always does. In village festivals, in dirty jokes tucked into Latin manuscripts, in the one idiot in every town who makes fart sounds with his armpits. But laughter remains suspect. Joy was tolerated, never trusted. In today's world, talking to your cat is quirky, harmless, possibly adorable. In the Middle Ages, potentially heretical. Definitely alarming. Maybe cause for a light exorcism. Medieval society had strict rules about who you could and couldn't converse with. People fine. Priests even better. But animals, angels, invisible voices, suspicious. Very suspicious. Cats especially danced on a dangerous line. Yes, they caught rats, but they were sleek, mysterious, and worse, never seen at church. If you whisper secrets to your tabby villagers, might whisper about you. Maybe that cat was your familiar. Maybe she taught you forbidden herbal cures. Maybe she knew where your neighbor hid his cheese. Birds also suspect. Medieval bestiaries were full of half-true, half-fantasy animal gossip. If you mentioned a crow had whispered the future in your ear, that wasn't charming. That was madness, or reason against sanity. Dogs, loyal, beloved dogs, were fine companions, until they showed up in your dreams, wearing robes and quoting scripture. Then people got nervous, and angels. They were everywhere according to the church, watching, guarding, whispering secrets during thunderstorms, claiming to see them once saintly, twice troubling, every day while shouting at clouds in the market square mad, possibly possessed. Imaginary friends. Children got a pass, usually, but adults. You'd better pray no one overheard you chatting with invisible companions. Otherwise, you were one of three things: a prophet, a lunatic, or future bonfire material. No middle ground. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen saw visions, spoke with angels, and wrote books about it. But she was cloistered, educated, and intimidated. She got away with it. You, a peasant named Bertram, talking to squirrels about theology, not so much. Mental illness in the Middle Ages teetered between two terrifying extremes. You were either an harmless village curiosity or a shameful family secret, sometimes both depending on the mood of the priest and the phases of the moon. Whether the village market was open or not, the spectacle of human struggle never took a holiday. Let's begin with public theater, the unintentional kind. When someone suffering from visible mental illness wandered through the town square, muttering to themselves, dancing barefoot in the rain, or engaging in a heated debate with a bucket, they didn't always meet scorn. Sometimes they became part of the scenery, like the leaning bell tower or that one goat who always escaped and took hostages in the bakery. People will watch, whisper, maybe laugh, not purely out of cruelty, though let's be honest. Cruelty make regular guest appearances, but out of a murky blend of amusement and fear. Because deep down, everyone knew that could be me next week if I ate spoiled eel pie or fall off a cart. These individuals were sometimes called natural fools, a term that sounds harsh, but was by medieval standards weirdly charming. Natural fools were seen as innocent, almost childlike, touched by fate god, or just an unfortunate timed moon phase. They could end up with scraps of food, a corner of shelter, and a nickname like Mad Will or Simple Meg. Not ideal, but in a world without therapy, it beats being locked in a stone tower. But for families, it was far less charming. If your relative was struggling, quiet, withdrawn, riddled with what we'd now call anxiety or depression, the answer was often not help, but silence. Medieval privacy meant don't talk about it. Ever. Shame was a powerful currency, and a troubled mind in the house could stain the whole family name. Some families hid their afflicted members indoors. Others quietly shipped them off to monasteries, hoping that divine geography might succeed where tea and prayers had failed. For the especially unlucky or disruptive or worst of all embarrassing at weddings, disownment wasn't rare. Public mental health care simply didn't exist. In its place was a thick fog of shame and whispered prayers. No clinics. No kindly social workers. Just isolation, superstition, and relentless pretending. By the late 15th century, give or take a plague, the tide ever so slightly began to turn. Not quickly, not kindly. But if you squinted hard, you could spot the faintest hints of compassion creeping in, like confused scholars blinking into the dawn. For starters, philosophy and science tiptoed into the mental health conversation. Arabic medical texts preserved and translated in cities like Toledo, Valencia, and Sicily began seeing back into Europe. These dusty volumes remind the West that ancient Greek thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen had once considered madness a matter of bodily imbalance, not demonic Airbnb squatters. Scholars began to flirt with the idea that melancholy and mania might have physical causes. Physicians scribbled treats about black bile and brain fog with a few less Bible verses and a few more anatomy diagrams. Don't get too excited, apply leech to temple was still in fashion. But at least they were thinking. Meanwhile, the concept of charitable care began to shuffle forward. Cities like Cairo and Valencia offered early hospitals that for the first time separated mentally disturbed patients from plague victims and sword wound survivors. A few daring institutions provided music gardens, maybe even conversation. Still no therapy, but at least you weren't being shouted at by a sweaty monk holding a goat skull. And then Gutenberg, the printing press. Books multiplied like rabbits at a midsummer fair. Ideas, dangerous, revolutionary ideas, spread faster than syphilis at a harvest festival. Texts on the mind and body reach new readers. Quiet seeds of Renaissance thinking were planted. Maybe madness wasn't sin. Maybe it was sickness. Or sadly. Or just bad luck. Of course, not everything changed. Fear of the unknown still ruled. The line between madness and mysticism remains thin as a monk's bedsheet. If you saw angels or preached prophecy, you might be blessed or burned, depending on your accent and your timing. But the groundwork was there. A tiny crack in the wall of superstition. A new idea the mentally afflicted were not merely cursed or wicked or divinely punished. They were human, fallible, suffering, maybe even deserving of care. Not hugs, though. That was still centuries away. Social suicide came easy in noble circles. Even leisure was dangerous theater. A grand ball wasn't merely a party, it was a battlefield of alliances dressed in silk and powdered faces. A simple walk in the palace gardens could become a silent war of glances and veiled barbs. In noble life, you weren't just existing. You were performing endlessly in an unwritten play, where the audience was everyone and the stakes were everything: reputation, fortune, legacy, and escape almost impossible. The very privileges that make the nobility admired also make them prisoners. Inheritance laws arranged marriages, suffocating debts, and the watchful eyes of rivals meant that even the wealthiest nobles rarely controlled their own fates. Behind the gilded doors of manor houses and chateaux, many suffer mental decline, quiet rebellion, or spiritual despair. But in public, always smiling, always impeccable. This was the great irony of noble life: the higher you rose, the less freedom you possessed. Born at the top, but often dying without ever having lived. Picture a nobleman striding through Versailles in embroidered silk stockings, or a lady gliding down a marble staircase draped in pearls. What you don't picture are debt collectors, but they were there waiting in the shadows. Behind the shimmering facade, many nobles were drowning in debt. Maintaining the illusion of wealth, it turned out, was more expensive than actual wealth itself. At Versailles, appearances were everything. A noble might spend more on a single waistcoat or ball gown than on the upkeep of an entire country estate. Why? Because fashion was currency. Fall behind in style, and you fell behind in power, influence, and solvency. Courtiers wagered enormous sums, not just at cards, but on horse races, land speculation, political favors. Estates were mortgaged, family jewels pawned, all for one more season in the glittering spotlight of court life. The kings, especially Louis XIV, delighted in this. His court at Versailles was designed not just to dazzle, but to drain. The more the nobles spent on looking the part, the more they needed the king's favor to survive. A ruined noble was an obedient noble. Across the Channel, things weren't much better. In Georgian England, lords and ladies dazzled in opulent London townhouses, financed almost entirely on credit. Tailors, wine merchants, milliners all waited patiently or impatiently for payment that might arrive months, even years later. Entire noble families teetered on the edge of ruin, praying that a daughter might marry rich, or that some distant uncle would die and leave behind a title, an estate, or at least a few usable chairs. Meanwhile, in Russia, nobles commanded vast estates and countless serfs. Yet many were cash poor, their wealth trapped in land they couldn't easily sell. Lavish lives in St. Petersburg or Moscow required quiet trips to the pawn shop, where tiaras and sabers changed hands behind locked doors. Family jewels were sold by candlelight to cover the next grand banquet. Even the noble samurai of Tokugawa-era Japan were not immune. As centuries of peace turned warriors into bureaucrats, their stipends shrank while their ceremonial duties and expenses remained. Some secretly taught poetry or managed estates for other lords to make ends meet. But to admit financial trouble was to admit dishonor. And so debts piled quietly behind closed paper doors. The truth was simple. Nobility wasn't financial security. It was the performance of wealth. And that performance can crush the soul. But financial ruin was only part of the noble burden. Scandal was the court's true currency. Affairs' secret children smuggled jewels betrays the more polished the public image, the filthier the private truth. Nobles wielded power, prestige, privilege, but restraint rarely. Versailles was a hotbed of rumors. Privacy didn't exist. Walls had ears, servants had tongues. Courtiers lived shoulder to shoulder, and illicit liaisons thrived in the suffocating closeness. Queen Marie Antoinette was a magnet for such rumors. Affairs with Swedish nobles, secret romances among her ladies-in-waiting. None of these tales were fully true, but they stuck because everyone knew someone was doing exactly that. The court practically ran on gossip. Scandal wasn't a liability, it was a tool. A well-timed rumor could destroy an enemy or raise an ally. England's aristocracy was no better. Salons, gambling halls, private clubs. These were the stages for the great dramas of reputation. Lord Byron incarnate Scandal was rumored to have fathered children with his half-sister. Did it ruin him? No, it made him infamous, his fame burning brighter than ever. But others weren't so lucky. A noble was expected to have mistresses, yes, but not too many, and not the wrong kind. Sleep with an actress, a commoner, or heaven forbid a foreign spy, and you risked exile, imprisonment, or an untimely accident. In Imperial Russia, scandal was practically official policy. Catherine the Great maintains a parade of lovers throughout her reign, elevating favorites to power as quickly as she replaced them. But it wasn't just the Empress. Her court thrummed with intrigue, political plots woven through bedroom whispers. Affairs weren't about love. They were about leverage. Even in the austere Heian court of Japan, where restraint, poetry, and formality reigned supreme, scandal bloomed like hidden plum blossoms. Lovers exchanged secret haiku. Veiled affairs thrived beneath layers of silk and social ritual. A misplaced fan or a clumsy poem could spark weeks of whisper speculation. The lesson was universal. The higher the status, the more dangerous the fall. A noblewoman might receive a midnight visitor whose name would never pass her lips. But the next morning, a delicate poem laced with metaphor and ambiguity will appear in court circles, sparking whispers that burned faster than candlelight. The most dangerous scandals, however, never made it into letters or poetry. They hid in shadowed corridors, encrypted in secret correspondence buried deep within family archives. Because in noble life, scandal wasn't the exception. It was the wallpaper, beautiful, intricate, and forever hiding cracks beneath the surface. For all their wealth and earthly power, nobles were haunted by something more insidious than gossip or debt spiritual uncertainty. Possessing everything did not shield them from existential dread. If anything, privilege makes the questions sharper, the doubts deeper. What did all this grandeur mean? What lies beyond the grave? In Catholic France, guilt hung in palace halls like old incense. The same nobles who knelt dutifully at Mass in the morning might plunge into debauchery by night. Confession became performance, a social ritual rather than spiritual relief. Yet as the years wore on, the masks slipped. Many nobles, especially in old age, became uneasy, afraid that their excesses might outweigh their prayers when the final judgment came. Some sought mystics and visionaries desperate for glimpses of salvation. Even Louis XIV, the Sun King, master of Europe, grew increasingly pious as death approached, afraid of the wars he'd waged and the souls he'd condemned. Across Europe, nobles poured fortunes into churches, monasteries, and shrines, not only out of devotion, but as spiritual insurance. A gleaming chapel here, 1,000 votive candles there, each a small plea for mercy, a down payment on grace. Others turned their backs on the court, entirely retreating to monasteries, trading silk for sackcloth velvet, for hair shirts, as if suffering could buy redemption. In Orthodox Russia, the burden was heaviest still. Nobles carry not only the weight of their souls, but of the nations as well. Czars declared themselves chosen by God's saints in ermine robes, and their boyars were expected to mirror divine order. But many wrestled with doubt, especially under rulers who mixed holy authority with ruthless paranoia. Some whispered prayers in secret circles. Others sought wisdom from Eurodivy holy fools who renounced wealth and comfort to speak unsettling truths no courtier dared utter. Even in distant Japan, among the samurai elite, the struggle was familiar. Torn between Confucian duty, Shinto ritual, and Buddhist detachment, nobles gained clarity in poetry and meditation. Some turned to Zen, chasing stillness to quiet their restless thoughts. Others composed verse not merely as art, but as spiritual confession, laying bare inner conflicts no sword could resolve. And when death seemed the only escape, seppuku ritual suicide was not always about shame. Sometimes it was about peace. For all their titles and silks, many nobles were profoundly lost. Trapped in webs of ritual and grandeur, they stared into the void and wondered if any of it mattered. Behind every perfect smile, behind every jeweled mask, there was a soul whispering or screaming for release. And in this world without emails or smartphones, the deadliest weapon was not the assassin's dagger. It was the letter. Ink on parchment could undo dynasties, expose lovers, ignite revolutions. The nobility, despite their elegance and restraint, were compulsive correspondents. They wrote everything: desires, fears, alliances, betrayals in the quiet darkness between flickering candles. These weren't casual notes. They were acts of survival. Love letters to mistresses, groveling pleas to subtle creditors, flatteries to the king, each word chosen like the stroke of a blade. Not all these messages were honest or safe. Couriers carried notes written in secret inks disguised by coded scripts. Nobles invented private ciphers for clandestine plots. The Duke of Orléans famously corresponded with suspected radicals, his letters a masterpiece of deception, until decoded years after his death, revealing a lifetime of treason stitched between lines of polite discourse. Habsburg court letters wove entire marriage negotiations through metaphors about hunting and weather. The falcons fly early this season might mean a secret alliance or an assassination plot. Lovers plotted elopements disguised as visits to distant estates. In Heian era, Japan poetry itself became cipher. A single 31-syllable waka could carry forbidden desire, rejection, or the promise of a midnight meeting. Noble women mastered this art, replying with verses layered in meaning, delivered by silent servants sworn to secrecy. During the Renaissance, letters became the preferred tool of espionage. Noble women in France ran entire spy networks from their salons, smuggling intelligence to foreign courts. In Imperial Russia, scribbled notes slipped past the Tsar's guards, fueling unrest and plotting rebellion. When swords and titles failed, paper became the final refuge, the secret weapon, the confessional booth, the shield. Of course, the most dangerous letters were the ones that never arrived. Intercepted, burned, buried behind walls or under floorboards. Some lay undiscovered for centuries, their secrets forgotten by history, their warnings unread. But make no mistake, within those faded, ink-stained scraps lived revolutions, heartbreak, and the raw, unpolished truth of the noble soul. They reveal what the silks and diamonds never could, that the nobles, for all their power and polish, were as fragile, afraid, and fallible as the peasants they ruled. Insult disguised as illness or private devotion. Others dared to wear last season's fashion, an unspeakable breach in a world where silk patterns were as political as treaties. A lace cuff out of date could send ripples through court faster than news of war. Even small acts, a glance held too long, a bow performed carelessly, could whisper defiance. In England's great houses, rebellion took literary form. A noblewoman might pen scandalous verses under a false name, smuggling her voice into the public sphere through satire and pamphlets. Younger sons, disillusioned with primogeniture, fled to the continent, seeking freedom in art or mercenary work, any escape from the crushing predictability of their birthright. Some gambled their inheritances away in London clubs, a ruinous protest against futures written by other men's hands. In Russia, where the Tsar's favor meant life or death, defiance was quieter still. A letter left unsent. A bow held by a heartbeat. A visiting envoy refused an audience. These tiny cracks in the mask were risky, but sometimes the only freedom left. Others turned inward, retreating into mysticism or philosophy. Russian salons became breeding grounds for revolutionary thought, where nobles read forbidden texts by candlelight, dreaming of a world where birth didn't dictate worth. Japan's aristocracy waged its quiet rebellions in poetry and silence. A misplaced seasonal reference in a court poem could hint at dissatisfaction. A nobleman's refusal to marry the emperor's chosen bride was rare, but seismic, sending shockwaves through the delicate machinery of court alliances. Some turned to Buddhism, shaving their heads, and vanishing into monasteries, an escape that costs influence, but bought a sliver of inner peace. But not all rebellion was subtle. Occasionally the tension snaps. A countess in France, humiliated and discarded by her husband, fled her estate disguised as a maid, living anonymously in a village until discovered years later. A Russian noble, enraged at the Tsar's policies, openly denounced the throne at a feast only to vanish into exile before the secret police could strike. In England, duels, though officially discouraged, remained an outlet for pent-up fury. A whispered insult, a coded letter, a dawn meeting with pistols or swords, these too were noble rebellions, waged in the old language of honor and blood. These rare explosions shook courts and cracked facades, but most noble defiance was quieter, sadder. A diary filled with unsent letters, a secret garden where a countess grew herbs no one else could see, a baron who played the lute alone in his tower, writing songs of longing he will never perform. In the end, the greatest rebellion for many nobles was simply to feel, to weep in secret, to love without permission, to dream of a life not scripted by birth or duty. In the grand, suffocating theater of aristocracy, these small acts of the soul were the bravest of all, for to be noble was not merely to possess land or titles. It was to carry the unbearable weight of the past on your back, while the present slipped by in silence, and the future remained forever out of reach. Who they truly were, what they called themselves, or why their civilization disappeared. But Evans believed he had stumbled onto the beating heart of Europe's earliest advanced society. As the excavation continued, wonders poured from the earth. Frescoes of dolphins, leaping bulls, and elegant women adorned the walls, vivid, colorful, and shockingly modern in style. There were no grand statues of warriors or solemn gods. Instead, the art was playful, sensual, and alive with movement. The Minoans, it seemed, celebrated life rather than death, a striking contrast to the grim tombs of Egypt or the militarism of Mycenae. Even more puzzling were the tablet's hundreds of clay plaques inscribed with strange symbols. This script, which Evans named Linear A, remains undeciphered to this day, a lost language locked behind an ancient code. What secrets did they hold? Trade records, hymns to forgotten gods, political treaties, no one could say. Yet for all the beauty and sophistication, the Minoan story ended in silence. Sometime around 1450 BCE, their palaces were burned, their cities emptied. The Mycenaeans of mainland Greece swept in, but they were heirs, not builders. The Minoan flame was extinguished, leaving behind only its ghostly traces beneath the soil of Crete. Evans was thrilled. He named and shaped the entire narrative, the Minoans, as the gentle, art-loving, possibly matriarchal civilization, the birthplace of European culture, the dream before Greece awoke. But even as he restored walls and repainted frescoes, sometimes too freely, critics argue, the truth slipped further away. Were the Minoans truly peaceful, or had their empire been built on unseen violence? Did the labyrinth serve a purpose, or was it simply a confusing palace layout? And what caused their collapse? Volcano, earthquake, invasion, or their own unraveling pride? Like the nobles of Europe and Japan, the Minoans had carefully crafted a world of beauty, performance, and permanence. and like them, they were swept away, remembered only in fragments. A fresco here, a gold ring there, a legend of a bull-headed man trapped in a maze. Evans stood in the dust of Knossos, surrounded by ruins and mysteries. He had found the palace, but not its truth. That, like all legacies, had crumbled beneath the weight of time. Because history, for all its stones and symbols, rarely preserves what matters most. The heartbeat, the fears, the whispering dreams of the living. It preserves the shell, the performance, the mask. And so the nobles of Versailles, of Kyoto, of Moscow, and the kings of Crete are bound together not by triumph, but by the quiet vanishing of everything they thought would last forever. The Minoan civilization, none loom larger than their sudden mysterious disappearance. For centuries, scholars have asked what happened to these joyful, sea-loving, art-filled people. Why did such an advanced, vibrant culture vanish so completely that even their language is lost to us? Theories abound. Some believe nature dealt the fatal blow, a cataclysmic volcanic eruption, on nearby Thera-modern Santorini around 1600 BCE. The explosion was one of the largest in recorded history, sending shockwaves, tsunamis, and ash clouds across the Aegean. If the Minoans had been caught in its path, the damage would have been devastating. Flooded ports, poisoned crops, darkened skies. The empire of sea traders might have collapsed as its lifeblood, the ocean, turned hostile. Others point to invasion. Around 1450 BCE evidence shows Mycenaean Greeks taking over Crete. Did they conquer a weakened Minoan state or merely walk into the vacuum left by disaster? The archaeological record is unclear. Palaces burned, including Knossos. But whether the fires came from enemy swords or internal revolt remains a mystery. Perhaps the empire rotted from within, succumbing to overreach, resource depletion, or political fracture. But most haunting of all is the possibility that their fall wasn't sudden at all, that the Minoans simply faded, absorbed into other cultures. Their gods renamed, their rituals repurposed, their memories diluted until they were little more than myth. After all, what is the story of the labyrinth of Minos, Daedalus, and the Minotaur, if not the echo of a forgotten civilization, transformed into legend by those who came later? In this way, the Minoans are not so different from the nobles of Versailles or the aristocrats of Edo or Moscow. Their world was rich, ordered, full of performance and beauty. They built structures meant to last lifetimes. They painted stories into stone, and yet history swallowed them just the same. Today, tourists wander Knossos' rebuilt halls, debating whether the grand staircases really spiraled so high, whether the throne room was truly for a king or a priestess or a god. Evans's restorations, both praised and criticized, blur the line between fact and fantasy. But the magic remains. To walk these stones is to feel the breath of a lost world, a civilization that danced with bulls, sang to dolphins, and disappeared into the sea of time. Their legacy survives in fragments, shards of pottery, flecks of paint, silent tablets written in an unknown hand. A labyrinth of clues, half solved, and maybe that's the true meaning of Knossos. Not a fortress nor a palace, but a monument to human mystery itself. A place where certainty dissolves, and all that remains is wonder. Just like the noble classes of Europe and Asia, the Minoans built for eternity and met oblivion. But in their walls, their frescoes, their myths, something lingers. A whisper from the Bronze Age saying simply, "We were here." To be an early form of Greek used by the Mycenaeans, Linear A remains stubbornly silent. Its secrets locked behind symbols that no modern scholar can confidently read. What little we do know suggests it was used for religious and administrative purposes, lists of offerings, inventories of goods, perhaps records of sacred rites. But the true content remains a mystery. The frustration is palpable. Here is a civilization that leaves behind grand architecture, vibrant art, and clues to a rich spiritual life, but whose very words, their voice across time, remain mute. Some theorize that Linear A records a language entirely unrelated to Greek, possibly a lost tongue of the pre-Indo-European world. Others suggest it's a ritual or trade language never meant for casual conversation, but for priestly use in ceremonies or temple management. Occasionally, scholars have claimed breakthroughs, translations proposed meanings guessed, but none have stood the test of academic scrutiny. The symbols carefully pressed into wet clay and fired by time itself sit in museum cases and archive drawers, waiting for someone to finally unlock them. Until then, the Minoans remain both known and unknowable, their world fully visible yet frustratingly voiceless. And this is the final riddle of Knossos, a palace of open courtyards, yet secret meanings. A civilization of light and color, yet shadowed in mystery. Their art speaks, their architecture whispers, but their language silent. What would these tablets tell us if only we could read them? Songs of the goddess, inventories of sacred oil and grain, the names of priestesses long lost to time, or perhaps instructions for rituals so alien to us now that they would read like riddles from another world. Whatever the truth, the legacy of the Minoans is clear. In their labyrinthine palace, their goddess-filled frescoes, their bull dances, and ceremonial courts, they built a civilization unlike any other in the ancient world. One where women may have ruled alongside or even above men. Where nature, ritual, and beauty were woven into daily life. Where mystery was not feared but embraced. Knossos is not just ruins. It is a question still waiting to be answered. A half-remembered song in the language of the sea. And until that day comes, when Linear A finally speaks again, the Minoans remain the greatest unsolved story of Europe's deep past, a whisper from the Bronze Age, forever echoing in the labyrinth of history. To be an early form of Greek, Linear A stubbornly refused to give up its secrets. It's a language unrelated to Greek and possibly unrelated to any known language on Earth. We can read its characters phonetically, but we don't know what they mean. Most linear ABTs found at Knossos are administrative inventories of grain oil, livestock, or offerings. But without knowing the language, the context remains elusive. Were these taxes, ritual offerings, market records? No one can say with certainty. The Minoans wrote for over 500 years, and yet we still can't understand a single full sentence. This linguistic blackout gives Konos its dreamlike quality. It's like listening to music through a wall. You can sense the rhythm, the energy, the intent, but the lyrics are forever muffled. We can see their rituals in art, their architecture in stone, but their thoughts remain sealed. Linear A was written with a stylus on soft clay, then baked by accident, preserved only because the palace was destroyed by fire. Without that disaster, their words might have dissolved long ago. Ironically, the burning of Nos gifted us with the only surviving fragments of Minoan language. Some scholars believe Linear A might one day be deciphered, especially if bilingual texts are found, much like how the Rosetta Stone cracked Egyptian hieroglyphs. Until then, we're left with isolated symbols. A man, a bull, a jar, a sun. Meaningless, and yet hauntingly familiar. Kenosis, for all its color and complexity, speaks to us in silence. Its language sits just beyond reach, reminding us that some of history's greatest voices still wait to be heard, buried not in earth, but in mystery. The Palace of Knossos, once a beacon of art, architecture, and ritual, did not vanish in a single cataclysm. Its fall was not swift, but layered a slow unraveling of a civilization whose power once seemed eternal. And like so many ancient collapses, the truth behind Knossos' downfall is a tapestry of firewater and whispers of war. Around 1450 BCE, something changed. Suddenly, across Minoan palaces and towns began to burn. Konos curiously did not fall immediately. Instead, it was reoccupied. But the fresco changed. The writing on the clay tablets shifted from Linear A to Linear B. Not Minoan, but Mycenaean Greek. This suggests that the Mycenaeans, the rising power from the mainland, had either invaded or taken control peacefully after a catastrophe weakened the Minoans. Whatever the method, Nos was no longer ruled by its native people. One theory points to the eruption of Terra, a volcanic explosion on the island of Santorini just north of Crete, around 1600 BCE. This cataclysm was one of the most powerful in recorded history, devastating the region with earthquakes and tsunamis. The resulting chaos may have crippled the Minoan economy, wrecked their ports, and weakened their influence, leaving them vulnerable to invasion or internal collapse. Others argue for a gradual economic and political decline. As trade routes shifted and rivals grew stronger, the centralized power of Knossos may have fractured. The palace, once buzzing with activity, became more administrative, more subdued. Ritual gave way to record-keeping. Art gave way to imitation. By 1375 BCE, the palace was abandoned entirely. Fires raged through its halls, roofs collapsed, walls cracked and buckled. Nos was left in silence, its colors fading, its language unread, its rituals forgotten. And yet, it was never truly lost. Legends of the labyrinth and the Minotaur survived in Greek myth. Hints of Minoan influence echoed through Minoan palaces and later in classical art and architecture. The soul of Nos lingered like smoke, invisible but present. Today, its ruins are open to the sun again. Tourists walk where priestesses once danced, and the palace that once held a civilization together now holds its secrets in plain sight, majestic, mysterious, and unfinished. When Sir Arthur Evans uncovered Knossos in 1900, he didn't just excavate it. He reimagined it with a mix of scholarly ambition and artistic vision. Evans set out not only to preserve the ruins, but to bring them to life. He believed that simply exposing the foundations wasn't enough. The world needed to see the palace as he believed it. Once was colorful, complex, and awe-inspiring. What followed was one of the most controversial restorations in archaeological history. Using concrete, a material completely alien to the Bronze Age, Evans rebuilt sections of the palace with modern methods. He employed artists to repaint fresco, using fragments found on site, but often filled in missing details based on assumption, not evidence. Balconies were reconstructed. Columns were restored, not in dull stone, but painted red with black caps based on Evans's vision of Minoan aesthetics. Rooms were roofed, walls were replastered, and the ancient palace slowly became a hybrid part ruin, part Edwardian fantasy. Some applauded his boldness. Without Evans, they argued Nos might have remained just another tangle of unremarkable ruins. His reconstructions made the site accessible, educational, and emotionally compelling. Visitors could walk through halls that felt alive, see murals bursting with color, and visualize the world of the Minoans with more clarity than ever before. But others saw it differently. Critics accused Evans of overstepping, of imposing his own interpretation on a civilization we still barely understand. The fresco, for instance, were sometimes almost entirely invented, based on small shards of original paint. Whole sections of the palace, such as the famous throne room, may have been assigned functions they never had. By shaping the ruins to match myth, Evans may have blurred the line between archaeology and storytelling. Today, Nos is both a marvel and a monument to the complexities of historical reconstruction. Evans' vision cannot be separated from the site. His concrete structures still stand. His artistic interpretations still color the walls. But visitors walk through Konos with a dual awareness of what the Minoans might have built, and what a passionate archaeologist believed they did. In trying to bring Nos back to life, Evans may have given us two palaces, one ancient, buried in the earth, and one imagined, standing boldly above it. Today, the Palace of Nos stands not only as a ruin, but as a bridge between myth and history, imagination, and evidence Europe and the ancient world. Long after its last ritual was performed and its halls fell silent, Nos continues to fascinate, mystify, and provoke. Its very existence challenges our assumptions about early civilization and forces us to confront how little we still know. The palace helped redefine the timeline of European history. Before its discovery, most scholars believed that advanced civilization began with the Greeks. Nos rewrote that narrative. Here was a culture flourishing 1,000 years earlier, with plumbing, urban planning, international trade, and symbolic art. The Minoans centered at Nos were not primitive. They were sophisticated, expressive, and deeply spiritual. But Nos's legacy is inseparable from its mythology. For millennia, the story of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth was dismissed as fiction, a fable to frighten or entertain. And yet, when archaeologists unearthed a palace with hundreds of rooms, corridors that looped and twisted, and symbols of bulls carved into stone, the line between myth and history blurred. Perhaps the legend was not invented, but remembered, filtered through generations, until only fragments survived. In modern times, Kossus has inspired not just scholars, but writers, artists, and architects. Its double axes, horned symbols, and sinuous fresco have appeared in fashion sculpture and even science fiction. The idea of a hidden ancient civilization beneath the Mediterranean still fuels imaginations. A vision of a time when power didn't mean pyramids or conquest, but beauty, ritual, and balance. Yet Knossos also reminds us of fragility. The palace fell. Its language was lost. Its people vanished. And its meaning, its real original purpose, is still debated. Every interpretation is a mirror reflecting not just the past, but what we want to believe about it. Walk its halls today, and you stand where priestesses once prayed, dancers once twirled, and children once laughed. You stand at the heart of the oldest palace in Europe, a place that lived between sunlight and shadow, between architecture and myth. Knossos may never give up all its secrets, but in its silence, it still speaks of mystery, memory, and the deep labyrinthine path of civilization itself. Lucius Domitius Ahenobas was born on December 15th, the 37th CE, a child of privilege but also of poison. His lineage was imperial, tangled in the Julio-Claudian dynasty that ruled Rome with both splendor and suspicion. His mother, Agrena the Younger, was the sister of Emperor Caligula, great-granddaughter of Augustus, and one of the most cunning political players of her time. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was known for arrogance and cruelty. It was said that when someone congratulated him on the birth of his son, he muttered, "Nothing could be born from me and Agrena but something monstrous." Whether that was a prophecy or just bitterness, time would tell. At just 2 years old, Nero lost his father to dropsy, or possibly to poison. In a Rome where alliances were fatal and ambition was a blood sport, Agrena now found herself a widow with a child and no real power. But she was patient. She watched as her brother Caligula spiraled into tyranny and was murdered by his own guards. She kept quiet as Claudius, the stammering, bookish uncle, was lifted to the purple robe. Then she made her move. By 49 CE, Agrena seduced Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, and married him. She wasn't subtle about her goals. Within a year, she convinced him to adopt her son as heir, passing over his own biological son, Britannicus. Lucius became Nero Claudius Caesar Deus Germanicus, a name fit for emperors. She arranged his engagement to Claudius's daughter Octavia and hired Rome's finest tutors to mold him. Chief among them was the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who tried to shape the young man into a noble ruler. From the outside, Nero was being groomed for greatness. Educated in rhetoric, poetry, philosophy, and music, he learned how to command a crowd, recite Homer, and manipulate public opinion. But Agrena still held the reins. She appeared beside him in ceremonies, ordered his household, and made it clear who truly wielded power. Nero's rise wasn't born from destiny. It was engineered by a mother who saw herself as empress long before her son ever wore a crown. And within that gilded nursery of ambition and manipulation, the seeds of a chaotic reign were quietly planted. In 54 CE, at just 16 years old, Nero became emperor of Rome. Claudius, his adoptive father, had died officially of illness, though many suspected poison, and the prime suspect, Agrena. She had long grown impatient with waiting, and when Claudius began reconsidering his biological son Britannicus's heir, she acted. Mushrooms, legend said, were the delivery method. The food of the gods, some joked darkly, and perhaps the food of murder. With Claudius dead, Nero was rushed into power. The Roman Senate approved. The Taurian Guard applauded, and Agrena stood triumphantly behind him, dressed in gold and flanked by guards, the real architect of the regime. But she hadn't raised an emperor. She had built a puppet. In the early months of Nero's reign, Rome prospered. He gave generous bonuses to the soldiers, held public games, and promised a return to Augustine values. Behind the scenes, governance was handled by two key figures: Seneca, the philosopher tutor turned speechwriter, and Barus, the pragmatic head of the Praetorian Guard. Together, they steered Nero through complex decisions while maintaining a veneer of noble restraint. But Agrena wasn't content to stay in the wings. She expected to rule beside her son. And when Nero began asserting his independence, tensions exploded. At first, the battles were subtle. She demanded to appear on coins beside Nero's image, something no Roman mother had ever done. She intruded on state meetings. She walked into the Senate chamber uninvited. She reminded Nero constantly who had made him emperor. The young emperor chafed under her control. He began to surround himself with his own advisors, men of pleasure and art, not of duty. He fell in love with Acte, a former slave girl, much to Agrena's horror. She had plans for a royal marriage, not romance with a commoner. The once close bond between mother and son began to sour. Whispers spread through the palace of shouting matches, slammed doors, veiled threats. Agrena, once revered as the empress maker, now seemed a looming threat. Rome had given Nero a throne, but Agrena still held the leash, and Nero was beginning to reach for the knife. His reign had begun with promise, poetry, and applause. But behind the curtain, a family tragedy was already brewing, one that would stain the imperial purple with blood. By 59 CE, the imperial palace had turned into a battlefield, not of armies, but of wills. Nero was emperor in name, but his mother Agrena still loomed like a storm cloud over every decision. She undermined his authority, opposed his personal life, and plotted in the shadows to replace him with Britannicus, the late Claudius's biological son. Nero, once the obedient boy with a lyre, had become a young man, desperate to escape her grasp. He acted first. Britannicus, a legitimate threat to Nero's throne, suddenly died during a banquet. Guests claimed he choked on his wine, but the poison was so fast, acting his death was unmistakable. Nero denied involvement. Few believed him. Agrena certainly didn't. With Britannicus gone, Nero's next problem was his mother. She had once ruled through him. Now he saw her as a rival. Agrena wasn't just politically ambitious. She was relentless. She met with senators in secret. She paraded noblemen she hoped to position as replacements. She made veiled threats about the Taurian Guard's loyalties. And worst of all, for Nero, the people still loved her. Rome admired strong women when they weren't too strong. Agrena had crossed that line. Nero first tried exile. He stripped her of her bodyguards, removed her from public appearances, and sent her to live in a coastal villa. But distance didn't silence her. She still corresponded, still whispered, still pulled strings. So Nero made a darker choice. He invited Agrena to a grand celebration, gifting her a lavish boat for her return voyage. That the vessel had been rigged to collapse mid-sea. When the sabotaged ship broke apart, Agrena survived swimming to shore under moonlight. The botched attempt enraged and humiliated Nero. So he tried again. This time he sent assassins to her villa under the pretense of an urgent message. Accounts vary, but one story says she faced her killers calmly telling them to strike her in the womb, the place that had given birth to Nero. Her murder sent shockwaves through the empire. Nero's guilt was immediate and consuming. He couldn't sleep. He paced at night. He saw her ghost in the halls. Rome, too, whispered of the unthinkable crime the emperor who had killed his mother. With Agrippina's death, Nero had finally broken free. But in doing so, he also severed the last tether to restraint. What followed would be a reign untethered by shame and spiraling toward infamy. With Agrippina gone, Nero was finally emperor in full. No more whispers, no more maternal oversight, just unfiltered power. But instead of channeling that power into military conquest or administrative reform, Nero turned inward. He didn't want to be remembered as a ruler. He wanted to be adored as an artist. He fancied himself a poet, a singer, an actor. He performed publicly something no Roman emperor had dared to do. To the Senate and aristocracy, it was mortifying. In Roman tradition, the stage was reserved for slaves and foreigners. But Nero was undeterred. He trained in music and drama, demanded applause, and filled amphitheaters with forcibly enthusiastic audiences. The emperor didn't just host games. He starred in them. Nero composed verses, sang tragic arias, and recited long epics of his own creation. He prided himself on his voice, even undergoing strange treatments to preserve it, including vomiting rituals, long periods of silence, and bizarre diets. Senators sat through hours-long performances, terrified to leave their seats. Not clapping could mean exile or worse. He also threw resources into building theaters, sponsoring athletic contests, and redesigning Rome to reflect his aesthetic tastes. He introduced Greek-style games like the Neuronia, a blend of Olympic sports and theatrical competitions, where unsurprisingly, Nero always won first prize. His obsession with performance spilled into foreign policy. On a trip to Greece, Nero insisted on competing in every artistic contest. At the Olympic Games, he took part in a chariot race with 10 horses instead of the standard 4. He fell off his chariot mid-race, but was still declared the victor. Why? Because he would have won had he not fallen. A triumph in Nero's eyes. Yet even as he indulged in these creative fantasies, the empire groaned. Administrators were neglected. Governors acted without oversight. The provinces grew restless. But Nero didn't care. He wasn't trying to be another Augustus or Tiberius. He wanted to be Orpheus Apollo, or maybe something even greater, a god of music with absolute power. To the Roman elite, he was becoming a national embarrassment. But to the masses, given bread games and endless entertainment, Nero was a living spectacle, a flawed god on stage singing over the cracks in his collapsing empire. In July of 64 CE, a fire ignited near the Circus Maximus. Within hours, flames surged through the city like a divine curse. The streets of Rome, narrow, overcrowded, flammable, became a furnace. For 6 days and 7 nights, the capital of the empire burned. By the end, 10 of the city's 14 districts were reduced to rubble. Thousands were homeless. Temples, homes, marketplaces gone. And where was the emperor rumors flew? Some claimed Nero had watched the blaze from a tower, strumming his lyre and singing of Troy's destruction. Others swore he had ordered the fire himself to make room for a new palace. Nero denied both, and in truth, he wasn't even in Rome when the fire began. But when he returned, He acted with theatrical flair, opening his private gardens to refugees, organizing emergency food deliveries, and funding reconstruction. Yet the whispers persisted. People needed a scapegoat, and Nero, ever the dramatist, gave them one. He blamed the Christians. They were already mistrusted. A strange sect of Jews who worshipped a crucified man and refused to honor the Roman gods. Nero accused them of arson and began a persecution so brutal it would echo through the centuries. Christians were torn apart by dogs, crucified, and most horrifyingly burned alive to serve as torches for Nero's garden parties. It wasn't justice. It was theater by firelight. Meanwhile, Nero unveiled his true ambition, the DOA, or Golden House. On the ashes of central Rome, he began constructing a pleasure palace of unimaginable extravagance. With artificial lakes, gilded walls, revolving dining rooms, and ceilings that sprinkled perfume, it was a monument to indulgence. A colossal statue of himself, the Colossus of Nero, was planned to tower over it all. To many Romans, this confirmed their suspicions. Nero hadn't just let the city burn. He had used the fire as a blank canvas. He had erased old Rome to paint a new one starring himself. But Nero saw it differently. In his mind, he wasn't destroying. He was creating. He was remaking Rome in his image, dramatic, divine, and unforgettable. In trying to immortalize himself through art and architecture, Nero scorched the earth and lit the fuse of his own downfall. As Nero's reign dragged on, the applause began to fade and the fear took its place. The emperor, who once danced across the stage, now paced palace corridors in a state of growing paranoia. He saw enemies in every shadow, conspiracies in every whisper. The artist emperor had become a tyrant in a mask of grease paint. Following the fire and the unpopular construction of his golden house, Nero's standing with the Senate deteriorated rapidly. The aristocracy, already offended by his performances and extravagance, now feared for their lives. In 65 CE, a plot was uncovered. The Ponian conspiracy, in which dozens of senators, equestrians, and even soldiers were implicated in a scheme to overthrow him. Some wanted to restore the Republic. Others simply wanted anyone but Nero. Nero's response was swift and ruthless. The poet Lucan, the philosopher Seneca, and the general Fenius Rufus were all ordered to commit suicide. Seneca, Nero's former tutor, and once his moral compass, was forced to slit his wrists while calmly discussing Stoic philosophy. Even those only rumored to be sympathetic to the plot were swept up in the purges. The palace became a house of executions, the Senate chamber a silent theater of obedience. The emperor's paranoia deepened. He accused his own wife Octavia of infidelity, a charge so flimsy it insulted the intelligence of even his closest allies. She was exiled, then executed. Her head was sent to his mistress Poea Sabina as a twisted token of affection. But even Poea wasn't safe. During a rage or possibly a drunken argument, Nero kicked her in the stomach while she was pregnant. She died soon after. Some say he wept for days. Others claim he mourned the loss of his muse, not the woman. Poison became a regular tool in his arsenal. He relied on the infamous poisoner Lusta, a woman whose concoctions had killed emperors and rivals alike. At Nero's command, she trained others, creating a small Makar academy of assassination. By now, Nero's court resembled a stage soaked in blood. Every friend was a suspect, every ally a potential betrayer. And through it all, Nero continued to sing, perform, and believe that he was loved. But the audience was shrinking. The laughter was nervous and the knives were getting closer. While Nero indulged in performances and purges in Rome, the empire beyond the capital began to rumble. The provinces, long the backbone of Rome's power, grew restless under the weight of neglect, extortion, and Nero's increasingly erratic rule. Taxes were high, governors were corrupt, and military prestige had eroded. In distant corners of the empire, patience wore thin and rebellion stirred. The first crack came from the east. In 66 CE, the province of Judea erupted into full revolt. Tensions between Roman authorities and the Jewish population had simmered for years, fueled by religious oppression and heavy taxation. When Nero's appointed governors desecrated sacred temples and looted treasuries, open war broke out. The First Jewish-Roman War began, and it would cost Rome dearly. Nero dispatched one of his most competent generals, Vespasian, to crush the rebellion. The last act of Nero emperor-artist tragedy, ironically. Nero's obsession with theatricality would prove fatal to his reign. In the West, darker storms gather. In Gaul and Spain, legions murmured with discontent. Nero's lavish excesses, the great fire of Rome, and his cruelty had drained the loyalty of both the aristocracy and the military. In 68 CE, Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gaul, declared open rebellion, accusing Nero of being a disgrace to Rome, a self-absorbed, unworthy performer of the purple. Vindex's revolt failed militarily, but it succeeded politically. It emboldens others. In Hispania, the powerful governor Servius Sulpicius Galba refused to recognize Nero's rule. Declaring himself the legate of the Senate and people of Rome, he became the first to openly call for regime change. Panic spread in Rome. Nero's allies fled or turned against him. The Senate sensed the shift and grew bold. Even the Praetorian Guard, once his fiercest defenders, was bribed by Galba's agents. Their loyalty, like everything else in Nero's court, was for sale. Nero tried desperately to rally support. He wept, begged, even considered fleeing east to start anew as a popular performer. But it was too late. The empire had turned against its self-proclaimed god artist. His isolation was complete. The provinces that once cheered him now lit the fuse of his downfall. Nero had lost his stage, and the curtain was falling. By June 68th, CE Nero was emperor in name only. The Senate had condemned him. The Praetorian Guard had switched sides. The people of Rome, once entertained by his games and theatrics, watched silently as their city held its breath. The empire that Nero had tried to turn into his theater now left him without an audience. On June 9th, Nero awoke to news that sealed his fate. The Senate had declared him public enemy. He was to be arrested and executed by the ancient Roman punishment of the poena culae, beaten to death, while naked, his head locked in a forked stick. The man who once performed to adoring crowds would now die humiliated and alone. In panic, Nero fled Rome in disguise. Dressed in rags, accompanied by a few loyal freedmen, he hid in the countryside villa of his former secretary. There, in an overgrown garden, the last Julio Claudian emperor crouched in a ditch, straining to hear the hoofbeats of approaching soldiers. Even in his final hours, Nero's obsession with legacy burned. When the sound of horses drew near, he famously cried, Qualis artifex pereo, what an artist dies in me. He did not mourn Rome. He mourned himself, his talent, his image, his tragic role in history. His companions urged him to end his life. Nero hesitated. For all his cruelty, he feared death. At last, as the soldiers closed in, he seized a dagger and with the help of his freedman, Epaphroditus, stabbed himself in the throat. The blade pierced, but death came slowly. Blood filled his lungs. His last words, whispered as life drained away, were too late. This is fidelity. He was 30 years old. The soldiers arrived to find him dying. There was no triumph, only astonishment. The Senate, now under Galba's control, ordered Nero buried in an unmarked grave. No funeral, no honors, no divine rites. A quiet, miserable end to a reign of chaos. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line of Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius was extinguished. What followed was civil war chaos and the rapid rise and fall of emperors. But one thing was certain: Rome will never forget Nero. His body was barely cold before legends began to bloom. Some rejoiced, others mourned. Many whispered that Nero had escaped to the east and would one day return. Over the next decade, no fewer than 3 impostors claimed to be the resurrected emperor, appearing in Asia Minor with lyres in hand and songs on their lips. The myth of Nero had only begun. For Rome's elite, his legacy was obvious: Nero the monster, Nero the megalomaniac, Nero the mother-killer and arsonist, the decadent performer who disgraced the empire. Historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio painted him as a warning, a prince who let vanity devour virtue. But not all remember him as a villain. Among the poor, Nero remains oddly beloved. He had reduced taxes, built public baths, fed the masses, and filled the arenas with free games. Vulgar, yes. Dangerous, certainly. But too generous. A strange populist emperor who gave bread and spectacle. Later, Christian writers demonized him further. Nero became the first Antichrist, the beast of Revelation. No longer just a bad ruler, but a cosmic evil. And yet, there was something magnetic in Nero's story. He wasn't the cold tyrant Tiberius had been, or the mad brute that was Caligula. He was flamboyant, absurd, theatrical, a man who ruled like an actor, lost in his own play poet god and tragic hero all at once. Even his death was a worthy scene of Euripides. For centuries, artists, writers, and filmmakers would resurrect Nero as a symbol of grandeur gone rotten, a warning of what happens when ego eclipses empire. His name became shorthand for decadence and decline. But perhaps Nero's strangest legacy is this: he made power performative. He understood centuries before mass media that image could shape history more than policy. That if you control the narrative, you control the future, and in that sense, he succeeded. 2,000 years later, we remember him, not as a ruler, but as a name forever burned into history's stage,